They say the proudest moment of an American father's life is watching his daughter walk down the aisle in a white dress, handing her future over to a man who promises to protect her. But for my dad, a self-made titan who built a real estate empire from a rusted toolbox in Chicago, his proudest moment wasn't my wedding day. It was his 65th birthday gala. It was the social event of the year, held at a historic high-rise hotel overlooking the city lights. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking sea of glittering crystal chandeliers, expensive silk gowns, and the soft, elite murmur of high society. I stood near the grand entrance, holding a glass of champagne. My eyes kept drifting to the massive velvet banner hanging above the stage. It read, "Celebrating 40 years of legacy." My heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of pride. I was Clara, his only daughter, his executive vice president, and the keeper of his deepest secrets. Beside me stood Julian, my husband of 4 years. In his custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, he looked breathtakingly handsome. He possessed that effortless, radiant Ivy League smile that could disarm anyone in a boardroom. As he greeted our distinguished investors and city officials, he did it with such grace and warmth that anyone looking at us would whisper, "There goes the perfect power couple." For years, I genuinely believed Julian was my anchor. He entered my life when I was at my absolute lowest, still reeling from the devastating loss of my mother to cancer. Julian was the one who gathered my shattered pieces. He threw himself into my father's business, working 18-hour days, easing the heavy burdens on my dad's aging shoulders. My father loved him like a biological son. I had handed Julian my life, my heart, and my entire universe. But on this particular evening, as I looked closer at my husband, a strange, icy chill settled over my skin. The familiar warmth in his eyes was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating restlessness. He kept checking his Rolex, his gaze repeatedly darting toward the VIP table where my father sat, laughing and sharing old stories with his lifelong business partners. "Julian, are you okay?" I whispered, reaching out to lace my fingers through his. His hand was freezing, and for the first time in our marriage, he subtly, almost imperceptibly, pulled his hand away from mine. A forced, mechanical smile stretched across his face. "Of course I'm fine, Clara. It's just, tonight is going to be a night Wall Street will never, ever forget," he murmured. His voice dropped to a tone so dark it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I brushed the uneasy feeling aside. I lied to myself, thinking he was just exhausted from organizing such a massive event. But oh, how I wish I had known. How I wish I could have seen through the mask. I was sharing a bed with a monster. A man who, in just a matter of minutes, was going to publicly strip away my dignity and destroy everything my family owned in front of hundreds of people. The grand ballroom lights began to dim, and the master of ceremonies took the microphone on stage. He invited my father and our family to step up for a very special presentation, a documentary film highlighting my dad's incredible journey from poverty to wealth, building a multi-million-dollar American legacy. Holding my father's hand as we walked up the steps, I could feel his hand trembling slightly with pride. His eyes were glistening with tears of pure happiness. Julian squeezed my shoulder gently and whispered, "Clara, I'm going to run to the tech booth to make sure the video playback is perfect." I smiled and nodded, watching him walk away into the shadows. I stood on that stage, looking out at a sea of 500 people applauding my father. Dad took the microphone, but before he could speak a single word, the massive projector screen behind us flashed to life. But it didn't show old family photos. It didn't show the milestones of our company. Instead, bold, blood-red letters slammed across the screen. The real legacy, an empire of fraud and deception. A collective, sharp gasp echoed through the ballroom. The applause died instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned around and looked at the screen. Confidential financial documents were flashing in rapid succession. They were heavily manipulated edited to look like my father had embezzled tens of millions of dollars from our own employees' 401k retirement funds. And then the sound system roared to life. A voice recording played through the speakers. It was Julian's voice. He was speaking to an anonymous federal investigator, saying, "Yes, sir, I have the proof. Clara's father has been draining the pension funds for years to fund his luxury lifestyle. He's a criminal." My heart stopped. The ground beneath my high heels felt like it was crumbling into a bottomless pit. The very people who were just applauding my father turned their heads, their eyes piercing into us with disgust, judgment, and cheap thrill. The whispers became a deafening roar. I looked at my dad. The color had completely drained from his face. His hands were shaking violently, and he suddenly clutched his chest, gasping frantically for air. A man who spent 40 years building an unblemished reputation was watching his entire life being burned to the ground in 30 seconds. "What is this? Turn it off. Julian, turn it off," I screamed, running off the stage toward the tech booth. But Julian wasn't hiding in the dark. He stepped right out into the center spotlight, holding a microphone of his own. The loving husband I thought I knew was gone. The man standing in the spotlight possessed eyes as cold and unyielding as stone. His expression was ruthless, almost triumphant. He raised his voice, letting it boom through the speakers. "I'm deeply sorry, Clara," Julian announced, his voice dripping with terrifying, fake sympathy. "But I could no longer protect a criminal. Your father is a fraud. And since I have officially acquired the majority shares of this empire over the last month through proxy votes, I am using my legal authority as the new majority stakeholder to remove him from the board of directors effective tonight." The betrayal hit my chest like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. In that agonizing second, a terrifyingly clear mosaic of the past 4 years flashed before my eyes. The endless nights he stayed late at the office, the stacks of legal documents he begged me to sign without reading, whispering, "It's for the tax restructuring of our family, Clara. Don't you trust me?" The subtle ways he isolated my father from our legal team. It was never love. It was a perfectly executed hostile takeover. He had married me for a key. A skeleton key to walk into our house, sit at our table, and quietly rob an old man of his life's work. The ballroom descended into utter chaos. Investors we had known for decades, people who had eaten at our Thanksgiving dinner table, immediately walked over to Julian's side, shaking hands with his lawyers. My father collapsed backward into a chair on stage, broken and humiliated. The press, whom Julian had secretly tipped off, breached the doors, their cameras flashing relentlessly at my father's pale, defeated face. Dad, look at me. Stay with me." I sobbed, collapsing to my knees beside his chair. But his eyes were rolling back. Julian walked up to us, looking down like a tyrant who had just conquered a kingdom. He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "Game over, Clara. You and your old man are officially on the street. I own this town now." That night, as the ambulance rushed my father to the hospital, I sat in the dim, sterile waiting room. My expensive gala dress was stained with my father's sweat and my own bitter tears. I felt hollowed out, exposed, and completely destroyed by the person I loved most. The media was already running the scandal on every news channel. Our company stocks were plummeting. Julian was celebrating his victory. I was entirely alone in the dark. They say that when everything you love is burned to ash, you either choke on the smoke or you become the fire. Sitting outside the intensive care unit at 3 o'clock in the morning, my tears dried up. A strange, eerie stillness settled over my soul. I looked through the glass window. My proud, strong father was hooked up to a dozen machines, fighting for every breath. This was the man who had protected me from every storm. And now, because of a parasite I let into our home, he was broken. My grief didn't vanish. It transformed. It morphed into an icy, unyielding strength. My trembling hands became steady. I stood up, wiped the dried tears from my cheeks, and looked at my reflection in the dark glass. Julian thought he had one because he took the buildings and the shares. He thought I was just a fragile, grieving woman who would crawl to him, begging for a settlement. But he forgot one critical detail. I am my father's daughter. He taught me how to build an empire, and because I helped build it, I knew exactly where the foundations were weak. The next morning, I bypassed the company entirely and went to see Mr. Robert, my father's oldest and most fiercely loyal attorney. Julian had forced him into early retirement months ago, but Mr. Robert's loyalty couldn't be bought with Wall Street money. Mr. Robert, I need to destroy Julian. Legally, publicly, and permanently. Will you help me? I asked, looking straight into his eyes. Mr. Robert sighed heavily, running a hand over his tired face. Clara, Julian was meticulous. Every document, every transfer carries either your signature or your father's power of attorney. On paper, he owns the empire. The feds are already preparing an indictment against your dad. No, Mr. Robert. He stole it. I replied, my voice dangerously calm. And a thief, no matter how clever, always leaves a digital fingerprint. Julian thinks he's a genius of finance, but he forgot that digital footprints never lie. For the next 2 weeks, the world thought I was hiding in shame. In reality, Mr. Robert and I locked ourselves in a basement office, surviving on black coffee and sheer willpower. I audited the last 3 years of our company's digital ledgers. I tracked every single login, every IP address, and every encrypted email sent from Julian's corporate ID. And deep within the system, where Julian thought no one would ever look, I found the mistake that would seal his fate. 3 weeks after the gala, Julian called his very first official board meeting as the self-proclaimed CEO. He sat proudly at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating absolute arrogance. Surrounding him were the high-priced attorneys he had purchased using our stolen money. The board members sat in tense, intimidated silence, waiting to hear the new dictator speak. Julian adjusted his tie, leaning into his microphone. Gentlemen, the old era of fraud is over. This company now belongs to a new vision, and I expect total compliance. Before he could finish his sentence, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud. I walked into the room. I wasn't wearing a deflated expression or a stained dress. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored black power suit. My hair was pulled back perfectly, and my eyes held a terrifying, absolute confidence. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before a mocking smirk took over. He leaned back in his leather chair. Clara? What a surprise, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. This is a private meeting for the board of directors. In case your grief made you forget, you no longer have a seat at this table. Security, please escort this lady out. Don't bother calling security, Julian, I said, walking slowly to the exact opposite end of the long table. I didn't come alone. I brought some very special guests. The moment I finished speaking, 4 federal investigators from the FBI and IRS stepped into the room. They wore badges, and in their hands, they held official federal arrest warrants. The smirk vanished from Julian's face completely. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backward against the wall. What is the meaning of this? Clara, what kind of childish stunt are you pulling? He barked, looking around nervously at the agents. The stunt ended at the gala, Julian. This is reality, I said, sliding a sleek, silver digital drive across the mahogany table. You spent months forging documents to frame my father. You used my personal administrative login to authorize those illegal transfers, thinking that if the authorities ever investigated, the blame would fall squarely on me or my dad. Julian let out a forced, nervous laugh. The digital ledger doesn't lie, Clara. The data proves the funds moved through your authorization. You're too late. No, Julian. You forgot one very important thing, I said, leaning forward, pinning him with my gaze. My mother, before she passed, left me a private, secure, offline digital vault. A vault whose encryption key only I possess. A vault you never even knew existed. Our company's main framework automatically backs up an unalterable history log to that vault every single night. The entire boardroom fell into a dead silence. I gestured to the FBI agent, who plugged the drive into the main projector. "Look at the screen, Julian," I commanded. "This is the unedited, real-time data." The funds didn't go to a retirement deficit. They went directly into an offshore shell company registered under an LLC in your legal name in the Cayman Islands. And that's not all. This drive contains the encrypted emails where you sold our proprietary corporate data to our largest competitors for millions. You didn't just commit fraud, Julian. You committed federal corporate treason. The lead investigator stepped forward, placing the heavy steel handcuffs on the table. "Julian Williams, you're under arrest for federal bank fraud, identity theft, corporate espionage, and grand larceny." Julian's face went entirely white, looking like a ghost trapped in a nightmare. His arrogance, his charm, his carefully constructed power, it all evaporated into nothingness in a matter of seconds. He looked desperately to his left and right, begging his expensive lawyers to speak up, but they silently closed their briefcases and looked away. In America, no one protects a sinking ship. As the officers grabbed his arms and forced his hands behind his back, clicking the cold steel around his wrists, he panicked. He looked at me, his eyes wide with terror, humiliation, and the pathetic desperation of a broken man. "Clara, please, you can't do this to me. I am your husband. We can talk about this. Clara, please look at me," he screamed as they began dragging him toward the door. I walked over to him, stopping just inches away, making sure he had to look up at me. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like ice. "You were never my husband, Julian. You were just a thief who managed to slip through the front door. And a thief always ends up in chains." As Julian was led out of the corporate headquarters, he was greeted by the blinding lights of 100 cameras. The very media outlets he had weaponized against my father 3 weeks ago were now capturing his own absolute ruin. His name, his reputation, and his life were permanently shattered. He was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. 2 months later, my father made a miraculous, full recovery and walked out of the hospital. Together, we walked back into our company. We fully restored the retirement funds to every single one of our loyal employees, rebuilding our family name to be stronger, cleaner, and more transparent than it had ever been. Today, as I stand by the floor-to-ceiling glass window of the executive office, looking out over the beautiful city skyline, I remember that terrible night of the gala. I remember the feeling of being completely shattered, humiliated, and broken. But today, I realize that night wasn't my ending. It was my awakening. Life has a beautiful, poetic, and brutal way of balancing the scales. Betrayal is a heavy poison, and it is designed to destroy you. But if you are strong enough to survive the venom, it gives you an undeniable, crystal-clear vision. Julian thought he was taking away my dignity, but in reality, he only forced me to discover exactly how powerful I truly am. Real power doesn't come from stealing someone else's throne or tearing down someone else's legacy. True power is the unyielding empire you carry inside your own soul. Your truth, your resilience, and your absolute refusal to stay defeated. My father smiles now, a genuine, peaceful smile, and that smile is my ultimate victory. My name is Clara, and I am finally the author of my own destiny.